stop everything and give me the next 90 seconds of your full attention, because what happened this morning may have changed the direction of this war more than anything we have seen in the last 11 days. 3 separate developments unfolded within hours of each other, and when you put them together, they reveal a picture far darker and far more dangerous than the headlines are telling you. This is no longer a conflict moving towards stability. This is a war entering its most unpredictable and explosive phase yet. First, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth stood before the cameras and announced what should alarm every person watching this conflict. He said today would be the most intense day of strikes inside Iran so far, with the most fighters, the most bombers, and the most attacks since the operation began. That is not the language of de-escalation. That is the language of a war that is expanding. Second, Donald Trump held a direct phone call with Vladimir Putin, and within minutes, global oil markets reacted violently. Prices plunged on just a few words that suggested this war could end very soon. But if peace is truly near, why is Washington preparing its heaviest bombing campaign yet? Third, new footage emerged from the strike near the school in Minab, and it may completely change how this war is remembered. What is now coming into focus is not just another battlefield tragedy, but a question that could haunt the United States for years. Did the first phase of this campaign cross a line the world cannot ignore? What made Pete Hegseth's statement so alarming was not just the promise of escalation, but the way he framed it. Standing at the Pentagon podium, he did not speak like a man describing the final blows of a campaign that was nearing success. He spoke like a man preparing the public for something much longer, much harder, and far more destructive than many had been led to expect. He said this would be the most intense day of strikes inside Iran so far, with the highest number of fighters, bombers, and attacks since the operation began. That kind of language matters, because governments often reveal their real expectations not through official strategy papers, but through the words they choose when they believe the public is not listening carefully enough. If this war were truly approaching its end, the messaging would sound very different. You would expect language about containment, pressure, progress, or controlled objectives already being achieved. Instead, Hegseth emphasized intensity, persistence, and timing on Washington's terms. That is not the vocabulary of a short conflict winding down. That is the vocabulary of a campaign still expanding its scope, still testing its limits, and still preparing the public for more violence ahead. What makes it even more unsettling is the contrast between confidence and caution inside his remarks. On one hand, he presented the operation as precise and effective, pointing to heavy strikes and major battlefield gains. On the other hand, he appeared to go out of his way to deny that this would become another prolonged American war. But leaders do not usually deny the possibility of a long conflict unless they already know the comparison is becoming unavoidable. The more he insisted this would not resemble the endless wars of the past, the more he signaled that Washington is already worried people may see the same pattern emerging again. That is why his words should be taken seriously. This was not merely a routine military update. It was a warning wrapped in reassurance. Hegseth was trying to project strength, but at the same time, he was laying the psychological groundwork for a conflict that may last far longer than promised. And when a defense secretary starts defending the duration of a war before 2 full weeks have even passed, that is not a sign of imminent victory. It is a sign that the war is entering a deeper, more dangerous stage. The Pentagon wants this war measured in numbers that suggest momentum, control, and success. More than come targets have reportedly been struck across Iran since the operation began. Senior officials say Iranian missile attacks in the region have fallen by 90%, while one-way drone assaults are down by 90%. On paper, those figures are meant to tell a simple story. The campaign is working, the enemy is being weakened, and American power is reshaping the battlefield exactly as intended. But wars are never judged by military statistics alone. Behind those numbers is another figure, one far more difficult to place on a podium and far more dangerous politically: civilian deaths. While Washington highlights targets destroyed and threats reduced, reports cited in the coverage say at least Motram Haimulam civilians have already been killed inside Iran since the conflict began. That number changes the emotional gravity of everything. It forces a different question, not whether the strikes are effective, but what kind of war this is becoming. This is where the Pentagon's narrative begins to crack. Because Kong target sounds like precision and dominance until you place it next to over 1,000 civilians dead before the most intense day of bombing has even fully unfolded. A Chin % drop in missile attacks sounds like progress until you realize the human cost may already be so high that the military gains are being overshadowed by the moral and political consequences. The reduction in drones may show operational success, but it does not erase the image of entire neighborhoods living under constant bombardment, or families paying the price for calculations made far above them. That contrast is what makes this moment so volatile. Washington is selling the campaign as disciplined and strategic, yet the civilian toll suggests a war whose consequences are spreading far beyond military objectives. Every strike may weaken Iran's capacity in one sense, while simultaneously strengthening anger, hardening resolve, and making the conflict even harder to contain. And that is the deeper tension in these numbers. The Pentagon is presenting evidence of progress, while the civilian toll is presenting evidence of escalation. Both can be true at the same time, and that is exactly what makes this war so dangerous. What matters now is this. Whatever damage Washington claims it has inflicted, Iran has not collapsed in the way American officials keep implying. Pete Hegseth has used the phrase combat ineffective to describe the impact of U.S. strikes, especially against Iran's navy, and he has argued that Tehran is steadily losing its ability to fight. But that is not what the battlefield is showing. Even after days of heavy bombardment, Iran is still launching missile waves, still forcing air defenses into action, and still finding ways to impose costs on its enemies. That does not look like a regime that has been broken. It looks like one that is adapting under pressure and shifting into a more dangerous phase of retaliation. And the form of that retaliation matters just as much as the fact that it continues. Recent reporting says Iran has been using cluster munitions extensively, with Israeli officials claiming that roughly half of the missiles fired in this stage of the war carried submunitions designed to scatter across wide areas. Those weapons are harder to defend against once they break apart, and they dramatically increase the danger to civilians on the ground. At the same time, reports describe Iranian missiles carrying larger warheads in the hundreds of kilograms range, reinforcing the sense that Tehran is not simply firing whatever it has left, but is deliberately leaning into heavier, more destructive options as the war intensifies. This is not the behavior of a force that has lost the ability to fight. It is the behavior of a force trying to make each remaining strike more punishing, more chaotic, and more politically costly. That is why the phrase, combat ineffective, rings hollow in this moment. A country may lose ships, launchers, commanders, and infrastructure, and still remain fully capable of escalating the human and strategic cost of war. In fact, that may be exactly what we are watching now. Iran may be weaker in conventional terms than it was on day one, but it is not passive, silent, or defeated. It is still striking back, still shaping headlines, and still proving that military degradation does not automatically equal political surrender. And if Tehran can still answer the most intense bombing campaigns so far with heavier warheads and wider area weapons, then this war is not moving toward exhaustion. It is moving toward a harsher and even less predictable stage. The Trump-Putin phone call matters because it introduced something markets had not seen clearly for days. The possibility, however fragile, that the war might not spiral immediately into a full energy catastrophe. Reuters reported that Trump and Putin discussed Russian ideas for a speedy end to the conflict in Iran, and Trump later described it as a very good call, saying Putin wanted to be helpful on Iran. At nearly the same time, traders were also absorbing reports that the Trump administration was considering reducing oil sanctions on Russia, including options that could allow countries such as India to keep buying Russian crude without fear of U.S. penalties. That combination changed the psychology of the market in an instant. It suggested that Washington might be searching for a political off-ramp while also trying to put more oil back into the system. And that is why just a few words from Trump can move oil so violently. Oil is not priced only on what is happening now. It is priced on fear, probability, and the market's attempt to guess what happens next in the Strait of Hormuz, in sanctions policy, and in the duration of the war itself. When Trump signaled that the conflict could be over soon, traders did not hear certainty. They heard a lower probability of the worst-case scenario, a prolonged war, wider shipping disruption, and a deeper supply shock. Reuters reported that Brent fell moi mot for chem 2, tam moi bai fire, tam moi a barrel, and WTI dropped moi mot fire, chin moi for chem 2, tam moi ba fi, born moi lum, marking the biggest single-day percentage loss since March, high in layer, high moi high. Another Reuters report noted that prices had already turned negative after news of the Trump-Putin call and reports that Washington was weighing further easing of sanctions on Russian oil. In other words, the market was not reacting to peace itself. It was reacting to the possibility that more supply could reach the market and that the timeline of the war might be shorter than feared. But that is exactly what makes this moment so unstable. If oil can plunge on a hint of diplomatic progress, it can just as easily explode again if that progress proves hollow. Markets are hanging on rhetoric because the underlying fundamentals are still terrifying. Intense airstrikes continue, Iran has not backed down, and the threat to regional energy flows remains real. So when Trump speaks, he is not merely making a political statement. He is temporarily resetting the odds in the minds of traders across the world. A few words from the White House now carry the power to add or erase tens of billions of dollars in market value, because investors understand that this war is no longer just a military crisis. It is an energy crisis, an inflation risk, and a global economic stress test all at once. What makes the Russia angle so explosive is that it sits at the intersection of war, oil, and great power bargaining. Reuters reported that after Trump's call with Putin, Washington was weighing options to ease pressure on Russian oil, including measures that could allow buyers such as India to keep purchasing Russian crude with less fear of U.S. penalties. Trump also said the United States was waiving certain oil-related sanctions to help ensure supply and lower prices. At the same time, the Kremlin said Putin had offered proposals aimed at ending the Iran war quickly. Taken together, those moves created the impression that Moscow was no longer just a distant observer. It was positioning itself as both a diplomatic intermediary and a beneficiary of any deal that calmed the energy market. But this is where the situation turns darker and more strategic. Reuters also reported on claims, first published by the Washington Post, that Russia had provided Iran with targeting information on U.S. military assets, while U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff later said Russia denied doing so in contacts with Washington. That means the most dramatic version of the story remains contested. Still, even the existence of that dispute is enough to raise the stakes. Because if Washington is considering softer treatment on Russian oil at the same moment Moscow is presenting itself as useful on Iran, then the geopolitical perception becomes unavoidable. The White House may be testing whether economic relief for Russia can buy diplomatic leverage over the battlefield. That is not a confirmed bargain on paper, but it is a strategic inference the market, U.S., allies, and Iran itself are all likely to make. And the consequences of that perception are enormous. If Russia can turn access to oil supply and influence over Iran into leverage with Washington, then the war stops being only a U.S.-Iran confrontation and becomes part of a wider realignment of power. Sanctions, once framed as punishment for Moscow, start to look negotiable under stress. Iran, seeing that possibility, has every reason to doubt American promises and harden its position. U.S. partners in Europe and the Gulf may also begin to wonder whether immediate energy stability is being prioritized over long-term strategic consistency. That is why this possible Russia channel matters so much. It suggests that behind the language of military escalation, another negotiation may already be underway, one in which oil flows, sanctions policy, and wartime diplomacy are all being traded in the same conversation. But beyond the airstrikes, the oil markets, and the power politics between Washington and Moscow, there is another story emerging from this war, and it is one that cannot be measured in barrels, missiles, or diplomatic language. It is the story of the school in Minab, and this is where the conflict stops being only a question of strategy and becomes a question of human cost, memory, and moral responsibility. At first, it was treated as one more tragic incident in a war already overflowing with destruction. But as more images, more testimony, and more scrutiny began to surface, the strike near the school in Minab started to look less like a background detail and more like one of the defining events of this entire conflict. Not simply because of the number of people reported killed, but because of what the location represents. A school is not just another building hit in war. It is a symbol of civilian life, of innocence, of a society trying to continue in the middle of chaos. When a school is struck, the meaning of the war changes. That is why this story demands a different tone. It cannot be approached with the same language used to describe oil prices or military effectiveness. It forces a slower, more uncomfortable question. What exactly was hit? Who was there? And how could a place tied to children become part of one of the deadliest incidents of the war so far? The answers matter not only for assigning blame, but for understanding how history will remember this campaign. Because once a war reaches the point where classrooms, teachers, and children become central to the story, the narrative shifts. It is no longer only about who is winning or losing on the battlefield. It becomes about what lines were crossed, what mistakes may have been made, and whether the violence has moved beyond strategy into something far more haunting. That is why Minab now stands at the center of this war's moral reckoning. What makes the Minab story so heavy is that the evidence does not point to a random battlefield accident in the ordinary sense. It points to a strike that appears to have been part of a larger, highly precise attack pattern. Human Rights Watch says satellite imagery and verified videos indicate that multiple structures across the IRGC compound were directly hit by guided munitions, including the school, which had been physically separated from the rest of the complex. The Guardian, drawing on verified video and satellite analysis, reported that a missile filmed hitting the adjacent IRGC site in Minab was geolocated by Bellingcat and identified by munitions experts as a Tomahawk, a weapon the United States is known to possess and Israel is not. That does not by itself close every question, but it pushes the story far beyond rumor. It suggests that what happened in Minab may have been the result of a deliberate strike package executed with precision, not a single weapon flying wildly off course. And then comes the most disturbing possibility of all. The school was not simply near a military site. It had once been part of the wider IRGC compound, but by Haing-in Lermoy-Sauer, it had been walled off, given its own entrance, and visibly marked for years as an educational facility, with murals and sports lines visible in satellite imagery. That matters because it raises the possibility not only of a targeting error, but of a deeper intelligence failure, that the strike may have relied on outdated or insufficiently verified target information. AP reported that critics and analysts believe the pattern of damage may reflect a failure to distinguish civilian from military structures. In other words, the building may once have been military, but by the time of the strike, it was functioning as a school full of children. If that distinction was missed, then the horror in Minab may not have come from lack of precision, but from precision applied to the wrong target. That is why the language around this case has become so serious. Human Rights Watch has called for the attack to be investigated as a possible war crime, and UN experts have demanded an urgent, independent investigation, stressing that schools are civilian objects and that intentional attacks on educational buildings that are not military objectives are war crimes under international law. Reuters also reported that the UN Human Rights Office called the attack absolutely horrific and said the forces responsible must investigate. So this is no longer only a question of who fired the missile. It is now a question of whether one of the most powerful militaries in the world struck a place it should have recognized as civilian, and whether the evidence from Minab will become one of the defining moral indictments of this war. And this is where the war stands now, trapped between two completely different signals coming from the top of the American system. On one side, Donald Trump is telling the world that this conflict could end very soon. On the other, Pete Hegseth is announcing the most intense day of bombing since the war began. Those two messages cannot both describe the same reality. One suggests an off-ramp is close. The other suggests the real escalation is only now reaching full speed. That contradiction is the most important fact on day 11, because wars do not become more stable when political messaging and military action begin moving in opposite directions. They become more dangerous. Markets do not know which signal to trust. Allies do not know which strategy Washington is truly following. Iran, facing both threats and hints of diplomacy at the same time, is left with every reason to doubt that any exit being offered is real. And when distrust takes over, escalation becomes easier than compromise. The next 48 hours matter because they will reveal which message was closer to the truth. If Trump is right, then diplomatic pressure, oil leverage, and back-channel talks may begin to cool the war before it widens even further. But if Hegseth's actions tell the real story, then what we are seeing now is not the beginning of the end. It is the beginning of a far more intense and unpredictable chapter, one in which heavier strikes, deeper retaliation, and even greater civilian costs become the new normal. That is why this moment feels so unstable. The language of peace is colliding with the machinery of escalation. One side says the war may be ending. The other is preparing for its hardest blow yet. And in the middle of that contradiction stands Iran, insisting that it, not Washington, will decide when this ends. So now the question is simple, and it may define everything that comes next. Do you believe Trump when he says this war will end soon? Or do you believe Hegseth when his actions suggest the worst may still be ahead?